Water is the most complete archivist there is, and also the most complete destroyer. It preserves things in the sense that nothing else touches them. It destroys them in the sense that nothing else needs to. Drop something deep enough, and it becomes inaccessible in a way that no locked archive, no sealed ordinance, no classified government file can fully replicate. You cannot file a records request with the ocean. You cannot petition the seafloor for documentation. What the water covers, the water keeps. And what the water keeps, it keeps absolutely in a darkness that predates the desire to look and will outlast any instrument we build to see by. Atlantis as a story has survived approximately 2,400 years in the cultural record. That is a remarkable survival rate for something that every credentialed institution with an opinion on the matter has classified, firmly and repeatedly, as fiction. Most fiction does not last 2,400 years. Most fiction requires, at minimum, a readership that finds it meaningful, an audience that returns to it, a reason that each new generation picks it up again despite having been told, by every authority available to it, that there is nothing there worth finding. Most fiction, when it has been definitively debunked, stops generating the kind of sustained, cross-cultural, multi-generational obsession that Atlantis has generated since Plato first wrote it down, and every scholar since has spent considerable energy explaining why it should be ignored. That pattern, the pattern of a story that refuses to die despite being repeatedly killed, is worth sitting with before you decide what kind of story it is. Here is the detail that the popular retelling of Atlantis almost always omits, not because it is obscure, not because it requires specialized knowledge to locate, but because it is inconvenient in a way that becomes visible the moment you lay it next to a different set of facts that the popular retelling also omits. Plato's account does not describe Atlantis as ancient in the way mythology is ancient. He does not place it in the time of gods and heroes, in the cosmological past before human memory, in the era that Greek literature uses when it wants to signal that something is beyond historical verification. He places it in the historical past. He gives it a specific timestamp. 9,000 years before his own time, he says, which would put the destruction of Atlantis at approximately 9,600 BCE. He gives its location with a specificity that his other mythological constructions do not share. He describes its political structure, its trade relationships, its military capacity, its architectural program. He describes it the way you describe something that existed, not the way you describe something you invented to make a philosophical point about hubris and the impermanence of power, which is the explanation that has been offered for the better part of 2 millennia by people who needed Atlantis to be a parable, because the alternative was a problem they were not equipped to address. The alternative is that Plato was recording something. Now hold that and pick up the other thread. Tartaria, in the cartographic record of the 16th and 17th centuries, is not a vague annotation. It is not a gesture toward the unknown East, a European name for the incomprehensible interior of a continent the map-makers had not personally visited. The maps are too detailed for that explanation to hold. The internal subdivisions are too consistent. The trade routes marked within its borders correlate too precisely with the archaeological record of actual overland trade in those regions during those centuries. Tartaria on the authoritative maps of that period is drawn the way you draw something you know about, not the way you draw something you have heard about from someone who heard about it from someone else. It has the texture of documented reality. And then, in the cartographic record, it stops. The landmass remains. The rivers remain. The geography does not change because geography cannot be renamed out of existence with a municipal ordinance, though there are a remarkable number of instances in the historical record where the attempt was made. What stops is the name. What stops is the acknowledgement that the thing the name referred to was a coherent, political, and administrative entity with a specific character and a specific relationship to the space it occupied. The official explanation is dissolution. That Tartaria was absorbed gradually into the Russian Empire and the Ottoman sphere and the Chinese administrative system, that its components were redistributed among successor states, that the name faded because the political reality it described had fragmented beyond the point where a single term could capture it. This explanation is available. It is tidy. It requires that you do not ask certain questions about the timing of the disappearance, about the speed of the cartographic consensus, about the degree of coordination visible in the way that multiple independent European cartographic traditions updated their records in the same narrow window. But there is a version of the Tartaria question that the dissolution explanation cannot touch at all, that it does not even try to touch, because it is not about the Tartaria that appears on 17th century maps. It is about the Tartaria that those maps were already looking back at. The Tartaria that preceded the Tartaria that Europeans were documenting, the one that the documentation itself treats as having deep roots, as having a history that the cartographers were capturing midstream rather than at its origin. The one that, if you trace the threads backward far enough, and if you are willing to follow those threads through the places where the official record becomes thin and the alternative sources become the only sources available, opens onto something that the Atlantis myth has been circling for 24 centuries without being given permission to identify directly. There is a thing that happened to the coastlines of the world between 12,000 and 7,000 years ago. This is not contested. This is not alternative history. This is geology, and the geological record is clear on the basic fact, if not always on the precise mechanisms. At the end of the last glacial maximum, the ice sheets that had covered significant portions of the northern land masses melted. They melted in a process that was not linear, not gradual in the way that word implies when we use it to mean slow enough to be invisible. There were pulses. There were events. There were periods of rapid change within the longer arc of change, moments when the meltwater input to the global ocean was large enough and fast enough to raise sea levels, not by the millimeters per decade we track with modern instruments, but by meters over years. The geological term for the most significant of these events is Meltwater Pulse 1A, which is estimated to have raised global sea levels by somewhere between 10 and 15 meters in a period that some models compress to less than 5 centuries. 10 to 15 meters in less than 5 centuries. Consider what that means for coastal civilizations. Consider what that means for any administrative culture that had organized itself around the geography of a world that no longer exists after the water rises. Consider what it means for the ports, the trade routes, the civic architecture, the street-level record of a culture that built near water, because every advanced civilization builds near water. Because water is transport, water is trade, water is the circulatory system of any economy sophisticated enough to leave behind the kind of material record that later civilizations would find and have to explain. All of it, in the most productive zones of the most productive coastal settlements, goes under. Not metaphorically. Not in the way that we say a civilization falls when we mean that its political structures collapsed and its population dispersed. Under, physically. Covered by water that does not recede. Preserved in the one environment that prevents decay while ensuring inaccessibility. On the continental shelves, in the shallow coastal waters of every ocean, in the flooded river valleys, and the drowned deltas and the submerged plains that were once the most habitable land on Earth, there is an archaeological record that we have not read, because we have not, as a species, organized a serious effort to read it. We have instead told ourselves a story about a sunken island. We have taken what appears to be a cultural memory of catastrophic, civilization-ending inundation, a memory that appears not just in Plato, but in the flood narratives of Mesopotamia, in the Vedic texts, in the oral traditions of coastal peoples on every continent, in a pattern of convergence that is statistically extraordinary for something that is supposed to be pure mythology, and we have filed it under legend. We have given it a name, Atlantis, that functions as a signal to any credentialed researcher that engagement with the subject will cost them something professionally. The name is the quarantine. The name is the mechanism by which a question that should be empirically investigable has been converted into a category error, a thing that serious people do not take seriously, a thing that the serious people's seriousness is partly constituted by not taking seriously. That is a remarkable thing to have done with a geological event that demonstrably occurred. Now put the two threads together. Tartaria, in the accounts that survive outside the cartographic record, in the merchant documents and the trade ledgers, and the administrative paperwork that surfaces in archives across Central Asia and the Middle East and Eastern Europe, is consistently described as old. Not old in the way that political entities describe themselves as old to establish legitimacy. Old in the way that something is old when the people writing about it in the 14th and 15th centuries treat its foundational period as beyond the reach of living memory, beyond the reach of institutional memory, traceable only in structures and systems whose origins nobody alive at the time of the writing could account for. The architecture is the clearest signal. The buildings that European travelers described in the Tartarian sphere with a consistency and a specificity that rules out collective invention were not, in the travelers' own accounts, recent. They were understood by the people who lived among them and used them and maintained them as inherited, as built by someone prior, as evidence of a time before the time that anyone could remember, when whoever had preceded the current inhabitants had understood something about how to build that the current inhabitants had not fully recovered. This is important. Not the buildings themselves, though the buildings matter. What matters is the structure of the memory. The way that the people inside the tradition understood themselves as the inheritors of something, as living in the aftermath of something, as occupying a civilization that had been preceded by a larger civilization whose full character they could only partially reconstruct from what it had left behind. That structure of memory, the memory of being downstream from something greater, of living in the reduced version of what had once existed at a different scale, appears in the Tartarian accounts. It appears in Plato. It appears in Mesopotamia. It appears in the Vedic tradition's descriptions of previous ages. It is one of the most consistent features of the deep historical record across cultures that had no documented contact with each other, and the explanation that it represents a universal human tendency to mythologize a golden past becomes considerably less comfortable when the geological record confirms that there was, in fact, a catastrophic event of sufficient scale to produce exactly this structure of memory in exactly the populations that would have experienced it. The flooding was real. The memory of the flooding is real. What remains to be established is what the flooding covered. There is a zone of the Black Sea that the geological literature has documented with considerable precision. Prior to approximately 5,600 BCE, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake, significantly smaller than its current form, surrounded by inhabited land. The land was inhabited. The archaeological evidence for this is not marginal. It is sufficient to have generated a dedicated body of academic literature. Ryan and Pittman, writing in 1997, documented the case for a catastrophic inundation of the Black Sea basin, a moment when the natural dam separating it from the Mediterranean gave way, and salt water flooded the lake at a rate that would have been visible within a human lifetime and terrifying within a single life. The land around what was then the lake shore, the land that went under, was among the most fertile and hospitable land in that region of the world. It was the kind of land that advanced agricultural communities settle. The kind of land that, if you were building a civilization organized around water transport and agricultural surplus and urban administrative centers, you would build on. It went under. The people who lived there, the ones who survived, dispersed. The displacement of populations from the Black Sea basin in the period following the inundation correlates with the appearance of new cultural influences across a remarkably wide geographic area from the Aegean to the Indus Valley, influences that the archaeological record treats as arrivals without clear points of origin, cultures that appear in the record as if they had emerged elsewhere and brought their knowledge with them rather than developed it in situ. Populations carrying, in other words, the memory and the technical knowledge of a civilization that no longer had a home, that had been physically removed from the landscape that had produced it, that existed in the aftermath as a dispersed knowledge-bearing community rather than as a geographically coherent state. This is what the flood narratives are, not mythology, not the universal human impulse to explain catastrophe through divine narrative. The Tartarian sphere, in its deepest historical layer, in the layer that its own later inhabitants understood as prior and foundational and only partially recoverable, was a Black Sea civilization. A civilization that had built, over centuries of environmental stability, the kind of infrastructure and administrative culture that leaves traces in the naming logic of cities, in the architectural vocabulary of public buildings, in the trade systems and the civic organization that later peoples inherit without fully understanding what they are inheriting or where it came from. A civilization that was flooded, that lost its geography while its people and its knowledge survived, dispersed, spread across the landmass that surrounds the water that now covers everything they built. And Plato, writing in the 4th century BCE, was not inventing. He was recording what the Egyptian priests told Solon, and what the Egyptian priests knew they had inherited from a tradition older than Egypt, a tradition that Egypt's own foundation myths treat as prior and formative and arriving from elsewhere, from people who came with knowledge already formed. He was describing, at a distance of 9,000 years, that the geology now makes plausible rather than absurd, the moment when the water rose and the civilization went under. He called it Atlantis because that was the name available to him, the name the tradition he was drawing on had preserved for something that the tradition itself could no longer locate precisely, something that had become a reference without a referent, a name without a geography, because the geography was underwater and nobody had told Plato to go look in the Black Sea. The name that the tradition he was drawing on would have used, the name that appeared in the administrative records of the successor civilizations that spread out from the disaster, the name that appeared on the maps before the maps were updated to reflect a different set of interests, was not Atlantis. It was Tartaria, and when the maps were cleaned and the streets were renamed, and the buildings that could not be explained by the official timeline were demolished and replaced with buildings that fit the story, what was being removed was not a conspiracy theory. It was not a fringe annotation or a cartographic error or the collective delusion of a pre-scientific civilization that could not distinguish myth from geography. What was being removed was the last surviving surface layer of a memory that water had tried to erase 9,000 years earlier and had almost succeeded. Almost. Because stone is more patient than water. Because naming is more durable than flooding. Because the thing that a civilization calls its streets, when it is left alone long enough, accumulates into a record that outlasts the civilization, that persists as a residue even after the institutions that produced the naming are gone, that sits in the ledgers of municipal archives in American cities, waiting for someone to look at it and recognize what it is pointing to. The water covered it first. The maps covered what the water left. The street names covered what the maps acknowledged. And then, in a single administrative window, at a speed that administration does not move, unless administration is not the right word for what is happening, the street names were changed too. What the ocean did in 5,600 BCE took centuries to complete. What the municipal ordinances did between 1890 and 1920 took a decade. The ocean had no choice but to move at the speed of geology. The ordinances had every choice. And they moved as fast as they did because the thing they were covering was not getting any more covered on its own. Because the water had done what the water could do. Because stone remembers in a way that water cannot prevent. And because the names sitting there in the everyday geography of cities that had grown up on land that had a longer history than the cities were supposed to have, were still pointing 9,000 years later, in the direction of something that someone in the last decade of the 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th had decided it was finally time to stop pointing at. The ocean keeps what it takes, but it is not the only thing that knows how to keep.